My name is June, and I'm 58 years old. 3 weeks ago, I left for a business trip to Denver, feeling grateful that my son David and his wife Jessica had moved in with me to help with expenses after David lost his job. I was actually excited about building a closer relationship with my daughter-in-law and having family around again in my quiet Portland home. But what I discovered when I opened my front door last Tuesday evening changed everything forever. Before we dive into the story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. I need to paint you a picture of what my life was like before that moment. My Victorian home in Portland, Oregon, had been my sanctuary for over 30 years. After my husband passed 5 years ago, I'd created a peaceful world surrounded by the things I cherished most. My rose garden behind the house bloomed every spring, with varieties I'd planted myself over decades. The reading room upstairs held floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with mystery novels and classic literature that had been my evening companions. My mother's vintage china collection sat proudly in the dining room display case, each piece holding memories of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. The old upright piano in the corner wasn't just furniture. It was where I played Chopin every evening, where David had taken his first piano lessons, where my husband had serenaded me during our early marriage. Every afternoon, I'd sit by the bay window with my tea, watching the neighbors walk their dogs, and feeling content with the rhythm of my quiet days. When David called 6 months earlier to say he'd been laid off from his tech startup, my heart broke for him. At 32, he'd worked so hard to build his career. Jessica, his wife of 3 years, worked in marketing, but their combined income wasn't enough to cover their expensive downtown apartment rent. Without hesitation, I invited them to move into my spacious home. I had plenty of room, and honestly, the house had felt too big and too quiet since I'd been living alone. Jessica was 29, ambitious, and had very definite opinions about interior design and modern living. From the moment they moved in, I noticed her walking through my rooms with a critical eye, making comments about how things were arranged so traditionally and how the house could really benefit from some updating. I tried to explain the sentimental value of my belongings, but she'd just nod politely before changing the subject. David seemed caught in the middle, staying quiet, when Jessica would suggest we declutter or modernize the space. I could see the stress in his eyes, torn between supporting his wife and respecting his mother's home. I decided to give them space to adjust and hoped that time would help us all find our rhythm together. When my company assigned me to lead a 3-week project in Denver, I felt torn about leaving. The night before my departure, Jessica had been particularly vocal about how the house felt cramped and cluttered, despite having over 3,000 square feet. She kept mentioning how nice it would be to have breathing room and make the place feel more contemporary. I gently reminded her that these weren't just possessions, but family heirlooms and memories. She smiled tightly and said she understood, but something in her eyes made me uneasy. Still, I chose to trust them. After all, this was my son and his wife. I left detailed notes about caring for my plants, gave them emergency contacts, and headed to the airport, hoping my concerns were unfounded. The flight from Denver landed at 8:30 that Tuesday evening, and I was exhausted from 3 weeks of 14-hour work days. As I drove up my familiar tree-lined street, I felt that warm anticipation of being home again. The porch light was on, and everything looked normal from the outside. I grabbed my suitcase, fumbled for my keys in the darkness, and pushed open the front door. The first thing that hit me was the emptiness. Not peaceful emptiness, but wrong emptiness. The entryway that had always welcomed visitors with my grandmother's antique coat rack and small Persian rug was completely bare. I dropped my suitcase and walked into what used to be my living room. Every single piece of furniture was gone. My burgundy sofa, where I'd read countless books, the coffee table that had hosted family game nights, the lamp that had belonged to my parents. Everything had vanished. My heart started racing as I rushed through the downstairs rooms. The dining room was stripped of my mother's china cabinet, the table where we'd celebrated every holiday, even the chairs that had witnessed decades of family conversations. In the kitchen, my everyday dishes were gone, replaced by stark white plates I'd never seen before. It was like walking through a house I'd never lived in. I ran upstairs, my footsteps echoing in the hollow space. My reading room, my sanctuary, was completely empty. The built-in bookshelves that had held my life's collection of literature were bare. My comfortable reading chair, the small side table where I'd set my teacup every evening, the ottoman where I'd rest my feet while getting lost in stories. All gone. Even my bedroom had been stripped of personal touches. The family photos, my jewelry box, the quilt my mother had made for my wedding. Everything that made this house mine had disappeared. I found David and Jessica in their bedroom, casually watching Netflix as if nothing had happened. They looked up when I appeared in their doorway, and I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, because David immediately sat up with concern. "Mom, you're back early," he said, glancing nervously at Jessica. "Where are my things?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Where is everything?" Jessica paused the television and turned to face me with what I can only describe as practiced calm. "Oh, June, we did some organizing while you were gone," she said, as if she was discussing the weather. "The house really needed to be decluttered. It was so cramped and dark with all that old furniture everywhere." "Old furniture," I repeated, feeling like the words were coming from someone else's mouth. "That was my life, Jessica. Those were family heirlooms, memories, things that belonged to my parents and grandparents." She waved her hand dismissively. "Don't worry, we didn't throw anything away. We were very careful. Everything is safely stored in the garage. We just needed to make some space and bring the house into this century. You'll see how much better it feels now." David looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight and avoiding my eyes. "Mom, I thought you'd understand," he said quietly. "Jessica worked really hard to organize everything while you were gone. She thought it would be a nice surprise. A surprise? I felt my legs getting weak. Moving all of my possessions out of my own house without asking me was supposed to be a surprise. "Let me show you," Jessica said, already heading toward the garage door. "You'll see that everything is perfectly organized out there." The garage had never been meant for storage. It was where I kept my car, some gardening tools, and seasonal decorations. Now, it was crammed floor to ceiling with cardboard boxes and furniture stacked haphazardly against the walls. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of motor oil and musty cardboard. My grandmother's rocking chair, the one where she'd held me as a baby, and where I'd rocked David during sleepless nights, was shoved against the back wall with scratches along its arms. Boxes labeled only with black marker numbers sat everywhere, giving me no clue what precious memories were hidden inside each one. I opened the nearest box to find my mother's china wrapped in newspaper, but several pieces were already cracked from careless packing. "You see," Jessica said behind me as if this chaos was some kind of achievement. "Everything is here, just organized differently." I pulled out a soggy book from another box, its pages warped from moisture that had seeped through the cardboard. It was Pride and Prejudice, the same copy I'd read to David when he was young, and now it was water damaged beyond saving. My piano, my beautiful piano that had filled our house with music for over 2 decades, sat against the garage's exterior wall, where moisture was already causing the wood to warp. "The piano couldn't fit in the house with our new arrangement," Jessica explained, following my horrified gaze. "But it's fine out here. We covered it with a tarp." A tarp? My piano, where David had learned to play Happy Birthday for his father, where I'd played wedding songs when I was missing my husband, was covered with a blue plastic tarp in a damp garage. I spent the next 2 hours in that cold space, opening box after box, finding my life's treasures treated like unwanted junk. Photo albums with loose pictures scattered throughout my jewelry box, with the delicate mechanism broken from rough handling kitchen items I'd used daily, for decades now buried under random household goods. David eventually joined me, looking ashamed, but still trying to defend what had happened. "Mom, I know this looks bad, but Jessica really thought she was helping. The house does look more modern now. Maybe this is a chance for a fresh start." A fresh start? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honest and kind. "David, this isn't a fresh start. This is erasure. Every memory of our family, of your father, of your grandparents, has been removed from our home." He couldn't meet my eyes. "Maybe you could just try living with the new setup for a while. Jessica worked so hard on it." That night, I lay in my stripped-down bedroom, staring at the ceiling and feeling like a stranger in my own home. This wasn't just about furniture or belongings. This was about respect, about being seen as a person whose feelings and history mattered. As I listened to Jessica and David talking and laughing in their room, completely unaffected by what they'd done, I realized that arguing with them would be pointless. They'd already shown me exactly how much my feelings meant to them. But I'd spent 58 years learning how to handle difficult situations, And I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful response isn't the loudest one. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I walked through my transformed house, seeing how Jessica had replaced my warm, lived-in home with something cold and impersonal. The living room now featured rented modern furniture in shades of grey and white. Abstract art hung where family photos used to be. The dining room held a sleek table that looked like it belonged in a showroom, not a place where families gathered for meals. In the kitchen, every trace of my personality had been removed. The herb garden I'd maintained on the windowsill was gone. The recipe cards my mother had written by hand, which I'd kept in a small wooden box by the stove, had vanished into one of those numbered boxes in the garage. Even my coffee maker, a simple machine I'd used for 15 years, had been replaced with some complicated chrome contraption. But what devastated me most was discovering that Jessica had been documenting her home makeover on social media. I found her phone left open on the counter, displaying photos she'd posted throughout the 3 weeks I was gone. Pictures of my outdated living room with captions like, "Before the transformation," and "Can't wait to show the results." Photos of the modern furniture being delivered with her grinning beside it. Comments from her friends praising her for finally getting that house updated and bringing it into the 21st century. The final post was from just 2 days ago, a photo of the renovated living room with Jessica posed in the center, arms spread wide with the caption, "Home Sweet Home. Finally feels like our space." The comments were full of heart emojis and congratulations on her amazing design skills. Our space. Not my space where I'd welcomed them. Not the space we shared as a family. Our space, as if my 30 years of life in this house had never existed. I overheard Jessica on a phone call with her mother later that morning, while I was sitting in the backyard, the only place that still felt like mine. "Mom, you should see this place now," she said excitedly. "It's like we finally have a real home instead of living in some old lady's museum." June seems a little shocked, but she'll get used to it. David says she just needs time to adjust to change. Old lady's museum. That's what my life's collection of meaningful objects had become in her mind. Not treasures, not memories, not the foundation of a family's history. Just clutter that needed to be cleared away so she could create her perfect Instagram-worthy home. When I tried to talk to David privately that afternoon, I found a stranger wearing my son's face. "Mom, I know this is hard," he said, but his words sounded rehearsed. "But maybe Jessica has a point about decluttering. The house does feel more spacious now. And she spent weeks planning this while working full-time. She really wanted to surprise you with something beautiful." "David," I said carefully, "I understand that Jessica worked hard, but this is my house. These were my belongings. Don't you think she should have asked me before removing everything I owned?" He shifted uncomfortably. "She was worried you'd say no, and then be stuck with all that old stuff forever. She thought if she just did it, you'd see how much better it could be. So she decided what was best for me, without involving me in the decision. Mom, please Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Jessica is already stressed about starting our new life here. She just wants us all to be happy. I realized in that moment that my son had learned to prioritize keeping his wife happy over doing what was right. The boy who used to defend me when his father was being unreasonable, who used to stand up for what he believed in, had become a man who chose peace over principle. That evening, as I sat alone in my transformed living room, surrounded by furniture that held no memories and colors that felt cold against my skin, I made a decision. I wasn't going to beg them to understand. I wasn't going to argue or create drama or try to make them see what they'd done wrong. I was going to take action quietly and decisively, just like my mother had taught me to do when words weren't enough. The next morning, I started making phone calls. First, I contacted my real estate attorney, Robert Hayes, who'd handled my husband's estate and had been our family lawyer for over 20 years. I needed to confirm what I already knew: the house was entirely in my name, with no legal claims from anyone else. June, the property is absolutely yours, Robert confirmed. You have every right to decide who lives there and under what conditions. If you want them to leave, you just need to give proper notice. My second call was to Morrison Moving Company, a local business I'd used when my elderly neighbor had needed to relocate to assisted living. I explained that I needed a very specific type of move. I wanted someone else's belongings moved from inside my house to a storage location, and I wanted my own belongings moved back inside from the garage. They were discreet and professional, asking only what needed to be done and when. I spent the next few days carefully documenting everything. I took photos of my damaged belongings in the garage, the water-warped piano, the broken china pieces. I made lists of what had been destroyed by improper storage. I researched local storage facilities and found one that offered first month free for new customers. During this time, Jessica continued to live as if nothing had changed. She invited friends over to admire her design work, hosted a book club meeting in my transformed living room, and even posted more photos online showing off different angles of their beautiful home. David went to job interviews and seemed relieved that his wife was happy, apparently choosing to believe that I was adjusting to the changes. Neither of them noticed that I was staying out of the house more often, spending long hours at the local library and coffee shops. They didn't ask why I was being quieter than usual, or why I seemed to be avoiding conversations about the house. They were so satisfied with their accomplishment that they assumed my silence meant acceptance. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after my return from Denver, I put my plan into action. I waited until David left for a job interview, and Jessica headed out for her weekly shopping trip with her college friends. As soon as their cars disappeared around the corner, the Morrison moving truck pulled into my driveway. The crew worked with impressive efficiency. We started with Jessica and David's belongings, their modern furniture, their electronics, their personal items, everything that belonged to them and everything they'd brought into my house. It all went into the truck destined for a climate-controlled storage unit that I'd paid for in advance. While they handled the indoor move, I worked in the garage with 2 additional crew members, carefully retrieving my life's belongings. My piano required special handling with protective padding and a dolly designed for heavy instruments. Each box of my possessions was opened and checked, with damaged items set aside to be properly disposed of or repaired if possible. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, my house looked exactly as it had before I left for Denver. My grandmother's rocking chair sat in its familiar spot by the bay window. My mother's china gleamed behind the glass of the dining room cabinet. The piano filled the living room corner with its warm, polished wood presence. Family photos smiled from their frames on the mantelpiece, and my books stood at attention on their shelves upstairs. I had the locks changed by a professional locksmith who guaranteed same-day service. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped David with homework for 12 years, and wrote 2 letters. The first was to David and Jessica, explaining calmly that they had 30 days to find alternative housing. I outlined exactly what they'd done, how it had affected me, and why I could no longer live with people who'd shown such complete disrespect for my home and belongings. I listed the storage facility address and included the key and paid receipt. The second letter was to my attorney, asking him to prepare formal eviction notices in case the informal approach wasn't successful. By the time David and Jessica returned that evening, I was sitting in my living room playing Chopin on my piano, surrounded by everything that made my house feel like home again. I heard Jessica's key hit the lock at 6:15, followed immediately by confused jiggling as she realized it didn't work. Then came the doorbell, ringing repeatedly, with increasing urgency. When I opened the door, her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, fury. "What did you do?" she demanded, pushing past me into the living room. "Where is everything? Where is our furniture?" "Your furniture is safely stored," I replied calmly, following her as she ran from room to room, taking in the complete transformation back to my original setup. "I've paid for 3 months of storage. The address is in the letter on the kitchen counter." David arrived 10 minutes later, having gotten Jessica's panicked phone call. He looked around the restored house with genuine shock, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Mom, you can't just move our stuff out," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We live here. This is our home too." "David, this is my home," I said, keeping my voice steady and kind. "You've been welcome here as my guests, but guests don't redesign their host's house without permission. Read the letter. You'll understand everything." Jessica was already reading, her face growing redder with each paragraph. "This is insane," she said, waving the letter in the air. "You can't kick us out because we tried to help you modernize this place. We were doing you a favor. Jessica, you moved my entire life into a damp garage without asking me. You posted photos of my personal space on social media, calling it yours. You threw away 30 years of memories because they didn't fit your aesthetic vision." I kept my voice level, stating facts, rather than expressing emotions. "That's not helping someone. That's taking over someone's life." "But we can't afford to move out right now," David said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. "Mom, I still don't have a job. We don't have money for deposits and first month's rent." "You have 30 days," I replied. That's more than enough time to make arrangements. I've been more than generous. Jessica tried arguing, threatening to call lawyers, claiming I was being unreasonable and vindictive. She accused me of being an ungrateful mother who didn't appreciate their efforts to improve my life. She even suggested that I was having some kind of mental breakdown and needed professional help to deal with change. But I'd spent a week thinking about this moment, and I'd prepared for every possible argument. I remained calm, repeated my position clearly, and refused to be drawn into emotional manipulation. By the time they finally stopped talking, it was clear that nothing they said was going to change my mind. David tried one last appeal. "Mom, I'm your son. Doesn't that count for anything?" "David, you'll always be my son," I said, "but being my son doesn't give you the right to disrespect me in my own home. If you'd spoken up when Jessica was planning this, if you'd defended me or at least warned me, we might have found a different solution. But you chose to go along with something you knew was wrong, and now you have to live with the consequences." They spent the weekend collecting their immediate necessities and staying in a hotel while they searched for an apartment. Jessica was coldly polite, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary, and making it clear that she considered me an obstacle to their happiness. David was torn between guilt and loyalty, apologizing privately while still defending Jessica's intentions. They found a small rental across town and moved out just before the 30-day deadline. The night they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by silence and familiar objects, feeling simultaneously relieved and heartbroken. The first month alone was harder than I had expected, not because I regretted my decision, but because the house felt different now. It wasn't just that David and Jessica were gone. It was that their presence had changed something fundamental about my sense of security and family. I found myself questioning everything. Had I been too harsh? Was there a sure way I could have handled the situation? Should I have tried harder to make them understand before taking such drastic action? But every time I started down that path, I'd remember the feeling of walking into my empty house, the sight of my piano covered with a tarp in the garage, the casual way Jessica had dismissed my entire life as clutter. Gradually, I began to rebuild my routine. I started volunteering at the local literacy center, helping adults learn to read. I joined a book club at the library, discussing novels with women who became friends rather than just neighbors. I took up watercolor painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was working full-time and maintaining a household for others. My neighbor, Eleanor, a widow in her 70s, whose husband had passed 2 years ago, became a regular coffee companion. She'd watched the whole drama unfold from her front window and offered a perspective I hadn't considered. "You know, June," she said one afternoon as we sat in my garden, "I think the hardest lesson for parents is learning that loving someone doesn't mean letting them treat you badly. You raised David to be a good man, but somewhere along the way, he forgot how to be brave. Maybe this will remind him." Eleanor was right about the importance of self-respect, but she was also right about something else. Healing takes time, and it's not a straight line. Some days I felt strong and confident about my choice. Other days I missed having family around so much that I considered calling David to apologize. But I didn't apologize because I hadn't done anything wrong. Instead, I focused on creating a life that brought me joy rather than stress. I took piano lessons again, relearning pieces I'd forgotten, and discovering new music that spoke to my current chapter of life. I planned trips with my book club friends, something I'd never done when I felt responsible for maintaining peace in my household. 6 months after David and Jessica moved out, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. It was David calling, not to argue or ask for money, but to apologize. "Mom," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "I owe you the biggest apology of my life. Jessica and I are getting divorced. She's been telling everyone that you kicked us out because you're selfish and couldn't handle sharing your space." But I finally realized that's not what happened at all. She convinced me that we had the right to change your house because we were living there, and I was too scared of conflict to stand up for what was right. We talked for over 2 hours that night. David told me about marriage counseling sessions where Jessica had insisted that my expectations were unreasonable about how she'd gradually convinced him that his mother was the problem in their relationship. He'd finally recognized the pattern when Jessica started making the same unilateral decisions about their apartment that she'd made about my house. "She threw away some of my college photos last week," he said they were cluttering up the bedroom. When I got upset, she told me I was being too sentimental about old junk. That's when I heard my own words, Mom. That's when I realized what we'd done to you. Our relationship didn't heal overnight. It took months of careful conversations, honest acknowledgments of what had gone wrong, and patience from both of us. But slowly, we rebuilt trust. David started visiting for Sunday dinners again, sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd taught him to do algebra, playing the same piano where I'd accompanied his childhood songs. A year later, as I sat in my living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out on my flourishing garden, I reflected on everything I'd learned. The house held all its old memories again, but it also held new ones, paintings I'd created in my art class, photos from trips with friends, books from authors I'd discovered in book club discussions. I'd learned that setting boundaries isn't mean, it's necessary. I'd learned that loving someone doesn't require accepting disrespect from them. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to show them that actions have consequences, even when those consequences are painful. David is remarried now to a woman named Sarah, who asks permission before moving so much as a throw pillow in my house. Jessica sends me Christmas cards, perhaps having learned her own lessons about relationships and respect. And I continue to live in my Victorian home, surrounded by the memories that make it mine and the new experiences that keep it alive. As I played Chopin that evening, the same piece I'd been playing, when they came home to find their belongings moved, I realized something profound. The music sounded different now, not because the piano had changed, but because I had changed. I was playing not just for the memories of the past, but for the peace of the present and the possibilities of the future. Looking back on that difficult time, I want to share what I've learned with anyone who might be facing a similar situation. Sometimes people we love will test our boundaries, not because they're evil, but because they haven't learned to respect other people's autonomy. When someone makes major decisions about your life without consulting you, they're telling you exactly how much your opinion matters to them. Listen to that message. The most important lesson I learned is this: you don't have to choose between being loving and being respected. Real love includes respect. Real family relationships include consideration for each other's feelings and belongings and space. When someone tells you that loving them means accepting whatever they do to you, they're asking for something that isn't love at all. I also learned that sometimes the most powerful response to being wronged isn't to argue or explain or beg for understanding. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply to act with quiet dignity, making decisions based on your own values rather than trying to change someone else's behavior. My house is once again filled with the things that tell the story of my life. My mother's china, my grandmother's rocking chair, my husband's favorite books, my son's childhood artwork that I've saved in careful albums. But it's also filled with new stories, watercolor paintings from classes with friends, souvenirs from trips I've taken independently, books recommended by my book club that have opened my mind to new ideas. The silence I chose over argument gave me something I hadn't expected the space to discover: who I am when I'm not trying to manage other people's emotions or accommodate their demands. I'm still David's mother, still a woman who values family and connection. But I'm also June, a person whose thoughts and feelings and history matter, whose home reflects her personality and values, whose boundaries deserve to be respected. If you're watching this and recognizing your own situation in my story, I want you to know that you have the right to protect what matters to you. You have the right to live in a space that feels like home, surrounded by objects and memories that bring you comfort. You have the right to expect that people who claim to love you will treat your belongings, your space, and your feelings with care. And sometimes, when words aren't enough, when explanations fall on deaf ears, when someone has shown you clearly that they don't intend to change their behavior, the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to take action that protects your own dignity and teaches them about consequences. What's your experience with family boundary situations? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between keeping peace and standing up for yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more real-life stories and share this with anyone who might need to hear that their feelings and boundaries matter. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that it's never too late to choose respect for yourself, even when it's difficult. I hope you find the courage to protect what matters most to you, and the wisdom to know when action speaks louder than words.